I'm delighted to introduce our next talk, which is in Strand 6 and will be given by Nayr Ibrahim. Dr. Nayr Ibrahim is Associate Professor of English Subject Pedagogy at Nord University in Norway. Her publication, Teaching Children How to Learn with Gail Ellis, won an award at the 2016 ESU English Language Awards. Her research interests include early language learning, learning to learn, bi and multilingualism, multiple literacies, language and identity, children's literature, and children's language rights. During Nayr's talk, we recommend watching in speaker view. And if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. Take it away, Nayr. Please share your screen.
Thank you. Right, and there we go. Okay, great. I hope everybody can see my screen. Thank you very much for coming to my session, and I'd like to congratulate the YLTSIG team for the fantastic web conference they have organized. As usual, I am thoroughly impressed. So I am talking about children's multilingual rights, and their multilingual identity. And I'd like to start by looking at this image of a classroom in the 21st century, which, as you can see, is wonderfully diverse. And this was actually, it's a photo from a project that was conducted in France about 10 years ago, actually, but it's still quite relevant, which identified classrooms as not just as linguistically and culturally diverse, and asked the questions about how this diversity could be seen as something positive, how this diversity could be seen as a resource in the classroom for learning to take place and for linguistic for the linguistic well-being of children. And but unfortunately, in order for this to happen, we are still having to counter the status quo in education, and that status quo is actually quite monolingual. So we need to disrupt that status quo, especially in ELT. And I'm just going to give you an example of how I experienced an example of this disruption. And this was at the TESOL Spain convention in 2016. Now, I actually did an opening plenary on multilingualism, so on growing up multilingual. And then I had this teacher come up to me afterwards, feeling quite agitated, and said, thank you, now I know I'm not crazy. Now, I was a little bit taken aback because my idea was not to tell anybody that they were crazy. But what was really interesting is that this teacher had a moment where she suddenly realized that being multilingual, or being a Spanish teacher of English, not being a native speaker, was okay. Mixing her languages, thinking perhaps in Spanish while she's teaching English, using all her languages in the teaching process was not crazy. And this actually confirmed that her multilingual identity was actually a resource in the classroom and not a problem. So I think we need more of these moments where we can disrupt the monolingual mindset. So I'm going to look at the linguistic, so these moments, but also linguistic identity and multilingual rights by looking at linguistic bullying and linguistic well-being. And linguistic bullying has happened for a very long time. And we have had people calling that out, researchers calling that out for a while now. And just some examples. The greatest impediment to recognizing and valuing and utilizing our language potential is the persistent monolingual mindset, which basically encourages us to think monolingually and does not and hides the linguistic diversity that exists in classrooms. Cummings said, we are faced with a bizarre scenario of schools successfully transforming fluent speakers of foreign languages into monolingual speakers. So the resources that come into the classroom that are multilingual are being not just hidden away, but are actually being killed. The monolingual ideology denies children or denied children an important cognitive tool for mediating language learning, reinforced linguistic discrimination, and encouraged decades of linguistic bullying. And this does have some serious damaging effects on the children's academic, social, and emotional well-being. And I think what we need to look at is encourage our teachers and our children, both the monolingual and the multilingual children that we might have in our classrooms, to understand the world as multilingual, because it isn't linguistically sanitized. It isn't monolingually compartmentalized. So even though we try and compartmentalize languages in the school system, the way we function with languages isn't compartmentalized at all. It is interdependent. And I think researchers over the years have been looking at this monolingual mindset in ELT. There is more of an interest in that at the moment. And they have come up with these 4 power dimensions of the monolingual mindset that has been created due to monolingualizing processes. And one of these monolingualizing processes is the discourse that we use to talk about our learners, our multilingual learners, and to talk about language learning. And it's usually polarized and divides, and it subordinates, or it just completely ignores the linguistic diversity that we have around us. And I think this is a wonderful example of let's not look at the sign because it's not written in English, therefore it's not important. And we don't know that we have nuclear tests happening in the area. So I think that's an important issue, the monolingual discourse. But that monolingual discourse also dichotomizes, so that it becomes an either or, an us or them. So the native speaker versus the non-native speaker, mother tongue versus emergent versus foreign languages, language interference versus cross-linguistic transfer, perfect bilingualism versus semilingualism. So all of these dichotomies create a kind of a war between your languages, when actually what they should be doing is existing harmoniously in not only the individual, but also in the class and in society. A lot of these dichotomous situations and this dichotomous dialogue and discourse comes from native speakers. And so it basically creates a certain group of people that are superior and that have some kind of linguistic birthright to a particular language. And then there's another group of people that, because they don't speak the language perfectly, or because they weren't born in that particular geographical space, therefore do not belong. So it creates spaces of belonging and non-belonging. And I've got these 3 examples of English language speakers who have different, were born in different linguistic contexts. And Mandela is very much like me in a way, in that neither of us actually had English in our early years. We both learned English at school. And yet, are we native speakers or not? Are we English, or what kind of English language speakers are we? I've got Jacinta Ardern because I absolutely love her New Zealand accent. And then there's the Queen. I've got the Queen because I've got a little anecdote which took place at my previous working context, where I was working at the British Council in France. And we used to have children and their parents come in for placement testing. And one of the parents came up to me once and said, I want my child to speak English like the Queen. So I promptly replied, well, I'm afraid the Queen doesn't actually teach English. He was not impressed. But why do we actually want to sound like native speakers when we don't have to? We just need to communicate, and we need to communicate that to our children as well, because otherwise it just silences them. And fourth, all of this is based on a separate language ideology that has been developed not only in research, but also in public discourse. It objectifies languages into separate entities, because there was a belief that languages existed in separate spaces in the brain. But then that Separation, we have actually transferred into the classroom, and we've created separate spaces in the classroom for learning, and in separate language spaces, as if we don't want to avoid, we want to avoid contamination, infection, afraid of a linguistic pandemic, perhaps? Well, we shouldn't be. Language, this linguistic bullying actually equals socio-emotional stress, and it has created quite a lot of socio-emotional stress in children. I've got just some examples from the last century and also from this century, and it's interesting, the comment there, the photos in French are in both cases actually equating speaking your local your language, your heritage language, in this case the local languages in France, whether it be Breton or the indigenous language of the country. They equate it to dirt. Parlez français, soyez propre. So speak French, be clean. The little girl with a plaque on her chest is from Wales, and she was forced to wear that plaque because she spoke Welsh in school, and therefore she was being shamed. But not only shamed, as at the end of the day, she was then also punished, physically punished, for having spoken Welsh. The two other examples on the right are actually in the 21st century, not so long ago. And the little boy is from a newspaper article that came out in 2014 in Luxembourg, where the children were being punished for speaking languages, for speaking their languages. Now, these are 3- and 4-year-olds, right? In kindergarten, they were speaking Portuguese to each other. That's how they communicated, and they were being punished. And the top is the same. And this was written by a Turkish-speaking 9-year-old who was caught speaking Turkish to his friend in a German school. And the children were punished, and they had to write a text answering the question, why do we speak German in schools? Well, my question would be, why don't we speak every other language in school? Why only German? So here we are, causing stress, and this stress also has an impact on how children see themselves, on how children perceive their identity and who they are and where they belong. And this study conducted in London in 2015 highlighted this fact. You've got 2 children. One is an Arabic speaker, an 11-year-old Arabic speaker, who asked, but Miss, who needs the languages of the immigrants? So this is how the immigrants, the status of the languages of the immigrants, and she has one of those languages. She sees it as completely unnecessary in her new context. The little one, the example below is a 4-year-old Chinese boy who told his mum when she came to pick him up at the kindergarten, don't speak to me in Chinese because Chinese is stupid. This is the message we are giving our children about who they are, about their background. And I'd like to also say that both of these children come from cultures, Arabic speaking, Chinese speaking, that have centuries and millennia of history, that have contributed beautiful poetry, literature to humanity. And yet we are telling these children that they're not good enough because they speak these languages, and they shouldn't be speaking these languages. Now, it's important for us to understand and to know that children do have linguistic rights, both and this has been supported at an international, regional, national, and local level. And at an international level, children's linguistic rights are enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Article 30 states that children have a right to practice their own culture, language, and religion, or any other one they choose. So they can be multiple speakers of multiple languages, and they should have the right to actually use those languages, not just to communicate, but also in the learning process. At a regional level, I mean, we are based in Europe. We have Europe, the EU has spent a lot of money and a lot of effort in supporting multilingualism. And the key competences for lifelong learning have just been updated in 2018. And what they added to these key competences is the multilingual competence. So a child, an individual, isn't only a speaker of a mother tongue or a speaker of foreign languages. This individual is also a multilingual speaker and then has to learn how to manage these different languages in the different contexts. At a national level, I'm using Norway because that's where I'm based at the moment, but at a national level, and if you think of your national levels, you'll probably find that they are actually quite multilingual. In Norway, we have official languages, Norwegian, which actually has two forms, and Sami, loads of indigenous languages, English and foreign languages in the curriculum, and 150 migrant languages. At the moment, around 20%, so 18.5, but nearing 20% of the population are immigrants or children born to immigrant parents, which basically means that these people, these individuals and these children have different languages they speak at home. This is the seeping into national curricula, and I think the Norwegian national curriculum actually has a very interesting focus on multilingualism, on linguistic diversity, where the student, it needs to help the student to safeguard and develop their identity in an inclusive and diverse community. A number of languages is seen as a resource. The curriculum for English also mentions multilingual and multicultural contexts and comparing English with other languages, not just Norwegian, but other languages. And the foreign language curriculum also mentions multilingualism. Now, this looks really good on paper, and it's brilliant. However, as Kalaya and Pietkonen Hushta state, they very often remain buzzwords on these curriculum documents, and they lack any concrete applications. So what we need to do is take these words and take these ideas and take these elements of linguistic diversity into the classroom and give children their linguistic freedom, because giving them the linguistic freedom equates to socio-emotional well-being. And I'm going to look at these two examples from my personal social media communication. On the left is the comment of a friend of mine whose daughter, 3 at the time, commented, "Papi, todo esto, say mine." Now, she's actually communicating in 3 different languages, Spanish, French, and English, and she has created this perfectly normal sentence with words in the right place. So structurally, it's correct. On the right was a comment from someone on Twitter who mentions that my 7-year-old's latest language mixing, "Que vamos a hacer with a drunken sailor?" I love that one. And I asked about the singing. Did he actually tried to sing it, which apparently he did. Now, I wonder how that works. So if we try and sing this, you will notice that multilingual singing works too. So, "Que vamos a hacer with a drunken sailor? Que vamos a hacer with a drunken sailor?" You could probably put another language in there. Let's try French. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait with the drunken sailor? Qu'est-ce qu'on fait with the drunken sailor? It works. So I think, and this is children having fun playing with their languages, and we are not allowing them to do this in the classroom. So what is this multilingual identity? This multilingual identity today it's contradictory, it's decentering, it's complex, and we need to understand that. So let's look at Mathieu as an example of that. In blue, he talks about mixing his languages because he says it's not like it doesn't come naturally. When I do it, it's because I want it, not just like that. So basically what he's saying is that mixing languages isn't something that happens because he doesn't know the languages. He chooses to mix languages. It's a communicative strategy that he uses in order to communicate with people. In white, he explains how if you were to take off one of his languages, English or French or Spanish, it's like you take a part of the person. It's like a part of the body. So this metaphor of ripping your body physically, parts of your body from you, is actually how he feels about not being able to use his languages. But the comment in black is really interesting, because this was a comment from his school context. So his mother is Spanish, is the Spanish speaker in the family. He goes to a French school. And when she went to pick him up one day, she realized, she started speaking Spanish to him, and he replied in Spanish. And all his friends were very surprised that he actually spoke Spanish. So she didn't know that. And she turns around to him and she asks, so why didn't you tell him that you speak Spanish? And he turns around to her and he says, why should I? Now, why should he be speaking Spanish in a French context to French children in French school? It didn't make any sense to him. This is not the right place for Spanish. So this multilingual identity is also about making language choices. And this child is showing how making those language choices at that particular moment, I'm in a French context, why I use Spanish, is really important for them. So it's not about using your languages all the time. It's about mixing languages where necessary. It's about using a particular language in a particular context. There's nothing wrong with being monolingual in a particular context. There's nothing wrong with monolingualism. What is wrong is the way it's used to suppress multilingualism. So, and yet you can see how much he holds on to his multilingual identity. Linguistic well-being, therefore, is about recognizing, acknowledging that children come to our classrooms with multiple languages. So they don't come to our classrooms as empty linguistic vessels, but as Galanti says, as tabula rasa, they actually bring the languages with them. And if teaching is about activating prior knowledge, when it comes to a language subject, when it comes to languages, that prior knowledge is children's prior linguistic knowledge. So their mother tongues and all the other languages that they have spoken. And I actually really like the little picture that I found while I was researching this session, how you can build a really strong bridge, a learning bridge, by allowing children to actually base their learning on their previous languages and on the linguistic repertoires. So why are we preventing them from doing that and not giving them that sturdy bridge for learning to occur? Now, linguistic well-being starts by knowing your students. You've got to go out there and figure out who they are and ask them about their linguistic backgrounds, ask them about their cultural backgrounds. So here are some examples of activities that I've used with children, bringing in objects. A little 5-year-old brought in her picture book in Gujarati, using language maps of the 12-year-old. And I love this language map because the child says at the end of it, it's to be continued. So he hasn't finished learning all those languages. Language silhouettes, and just children's getting them to draw their identity text, to create identity text, so that these languages become visible and they exist in the classroom. And then all the other children actually know who we are and where we come from and what our background is. But it is also about knowing yourselves. Know thyself, teachers. It is important that teachers also create their own identity texts and divulge these identity texts to their children. I work a lot with teachers and I get them to draw language maps. I get them to, I've drawn my own language silhouettes. Or then I get them to create what I've been calling these dominant language constellation artifacts, where teachers actually in a physical arts-based and approach, they actually place their languages in different objects, and then they explain how these languages, how important these languages are for them. And it's really interesting when you actually ask teachers to identify their language repertoires and to identify the languages in their language repertoires, because they very often come back and say, oh, I didn't know I was multilingual. I didn't actually consider myself to be multilingual. And yet when you make it explicit, they suddenly start seeing themselves differently through the multilingual lens, as opposed to the monolingual lens. And I just wanted, oops, this went really quickly, just wanted to give you an example of what happens when you actually go out there and you ask the teachers to, and you ask children or your class to unveil their multilingualism. And this is from my previous working context at the British Council in France, where we had a bilingual section, and we always identify these children as English. We still have the bilingual section, still exists, as English French bilinguals. One day we asked them about their languages, and this is what we discovered. There were so many other languages that these children spoke. They were multilingual, they were not bilingual. So it's really wonderful to discover this, but we need to go out there and ask them explicitly to unveil this linguistic background, because bringing languages into the classroom creates inclusive classrooms that see the multilingual children as speakers of multiple languages, and not just mere learners of English or Norwegian. It makes those languages visible, it celebrates linguistic diversity, and then we can draw on these languages to create a safe learning space for the children. And you as a teacher do not need to know all these languages. You can hand that over to the students because they are the experts in their own languages. Multilingual well-being also means bringing in multilingual practices and not being afraid of multilingual practices. This is just an example of an activity I did with my first year MA students, and we were working with the pre-teaching of vocabulary, and I used a picture book. I do love using picture books in my teaching. And so the pre-teaching of vocabulary led to a wonderful exploration of all the different languages, of the vocabulary in English in the different languages that the teachers knew. And here you've got Spanish and French, but you've also got Latvian. That's the words in that space, because one of the teachers was Latvian. And then this allowed us to actually have wonderful phonological, so metalinguistic phonological discussions about the words. And we looked at the fact that there was an accent on two words, so six parnis, menes, which means that there was emphasis on those particular syllables, which of course in English doesn't work like that, because we don't really have accents on words in English. So we had this comparator. We discussed. It was an opportunity for us to compare languages, and also for the teacher to expose herself and her multilingual identity. We need to bring in multilingual resources. We don't have multilingual resources. Course books do not address this at all, but I would highly recommend bilingual and multilingual picture books, because you can use them, and by using them, bring in different languages, not just the languages that the children speak in the classroom, but bringing other linguistic resources. Some of the books I've used, for example, Marisol McDonald Doesn't Match is one of my favorites, simply because it actually is a multilingual child who mixes everything, not just her languages, her clothes, the way she writes. She just mixes everything. It's all about mixing. And so this child becomes representative of all the multilingual children out there and how they function on a daily basis. And it makes them feel good about themselves. Okay, so I'm not the only one. There are also these characters in the literature that I can see myself in. And I think we need to ensure that the children see, these multilingual children also see themselves in their in the literature. So moving from linguistic bullying to linguistic well-being means that we need to consider and think about the terminology we use when referring to multilingual children and language learning generally. We need to create linguistically inclusive English classrooms so that the children can see themselves as multilingual in the classrooms. We need to know ourselves, and we need to know our learners so that we can have this conversation about multilingualism. And most importantly, and I think that's something that teachers need a lot of, is that we need to develop our knowledge and skills of teaching multilingually. And I think there's a lot of work to do where that's concerned. Thank you very much.
So much, Nayr. Again, it was another one of your talks where I was scribbling notes, so many of them. And the thing that I think that struck me the most was the use of the term linguistic bullying, because I hadn't really thought of it that way, but actually when you describe the pressure that is put on children to have, or on all of us in a way, to have like a monolingual mindset, and that actually human beings don't fit into that, and they never have and they never will. So just, you know, yeah, fascinating, talking about recognizing children's multilingual identity, you know, the fact that children do make language choices. It's not like this random thing that they just put together necessarily. Yeah, just fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so now everybody, we're going to have a 5-minute break before the next session, which is a quiz. So thank you very much.